The iPhone 6s is Apple's longest supported iPhone ever. Launching with iOS 9, this thing is still supported on the latest version of iOS 15. But soon, it looks like the iPhone 6s will be dropped with iOS 16 here in a couple days. So today, let's look back at the legend that is the iPhone 6s. The iPhone 6s and 6s Plus were announced on September 9th, 2015 at an Apple special event in the Pilgrim Civic Auditorium. By the name, these devices were small upgrades over the iPhone 6 and 6 Plus, but what the iPhone 6s and 6s Plus brought to the table were far from a small upgrade. First was the camera, and yes, every year the iPhone camera gets better and better and better, but the iPhone 6s had some upgrades that paved the way for the iPhone camera even to today. First was the megapixel count. The original iPhone 3G had 2 megapixel sensors, then the 3GS increased that to 3 megapixels, then the iPhone 4 increased that again to 5 megapixels, then the iPhone 4S increased that again to 8 megapixels. Apple stuck with 8 megapixels until the iPhone 6S, which is when they increased it to 12 megapixels. And even today with the iPhone 13 Pro, we're still using a 12 megapixel sensor, or 3 12 megapixel sensors. It looks like that's about to change with the iPhone 14 Pro, where that will increase to 48 megapixels. But it'll use pixel binning, so you'll still end up with a 12 megapixel photo, but with the details of a 48 megapixel photo. And the 12 megapixel camera allowed for the iPhone 6s to record 4K video for the first time ever. And this was really when the iPhone started to show off its video capabilities in the camera when compared to other smartphones. The iPhone 6s recorded at 4K 30 FPS. Not the first time a phone could record at 4K, but was definitely the best implementation of 4K video recording on a smartphone at the time. We still use 4K video recording on the iPhone today, now with 4K 24 FPS, 4K 25 FPS, and 4K 60 FPS options. And with the upcoming iPhone 14 Pro, we're expected to see 8K video recording on the iPhone for the first time ever. Not the first time 8K was added to a smartphone, but definitely going to be the best implementation of 8K. The next biggest thing added to the iPhone 6s was its performance. Apple upgraded to the A9 chip in the iPhone 6s, which is one of the biggest upgrades in Apple's silicon history. The A9 was over 70% faster than the A8. Back then, chip upgrades were a lot more substantial. Now we're used to chips only being like 15% faster than the older generation. The iPhone 6s was also the first year Apple started using 2GB of RAM in the iPhone, which might sound like very little for today's standards, knowing that the current iPhone is at 6GB of RAM, but this very change allowed the iPhone 6s to become the longest supporting iPhone in history and the longest supporting smartphone in history, because the current versions of iOS and iPadOS require at least 2GB of RAM. The A9 was also the first chip capable of Apple's AR-Kit, and this is why the A8 and A8X devices don't support AR. AR-Kit wouldn't be released until iOS 11 in 2017, but the iPhone 6s was the first device to support it. The A9 was also the first chip to have HEVC decoding implemented with support of Main 8 and Main 10. Again, HEVC wouldn't be added to iOS until iOS 11, but the iPhone 6s already supported it. The A9 was a monumental leap for Apple Silicon. Next, the screen. Now, the screen was kind of outdated even back then because it wasn't OLED, it was still LCD, and it was pretty low resolution at 1334 by 750 on the iPhone 6s and 1920 by 1080 on the 6s Plus. That was kind of decent though. But there was one thing added to these displays that I and a lot of people missed that Apple removed later on. 3D Touch. 3D Touch allowed you to force press on the display, and this allowed for some cool things. You can peek at a website URL or contact or whatever else and force press harder to pop it open. We still have the peeking functionality, but we don't have the popping functionality anymore. And some clever developers did some cool things with it. There's a website that allows any 3D Touch-enabled device to act as a scale. It was really cool. We have haptic touch right now, which still uses the Taptic engine, but doesn't have the sensitivity layer to allow for 3D touch. Now, there was one thing that was very controversial about the iPhone 6s, and that's the battery. First, the battery wasn't even very good in the first place, having even smaller batteries than the iPhone 6 and 6 Plus. But what was really controversial about the iPhone 6s was the infamous unexpected shutdown issue. On November 21st, 2016, Apple announced an unexpected shutdown repair program for the iPhone 6s and 6s Plus, where if your iPhone shuts down before the battery dies, you are eligible for a free battery replacement. That sounds pretty good. And Apple promised in iOS 10.2.1 that the issue shouldn't really happen anymore. But that was because of something else that Apple was doing in the background that really started some controversy. In December of 2017, December of 2017, that's over 10 months after iOS 10.2.1 was released, people started noticing that Geekbench numbers on older iPhones, specifically the iPhone 6, 6 Plus, 6S, 6S Plus, 7, and 7 Plus models, were lower than usual. And we're not talking 10 or maybe 100 points lower. No, almost half of the performance of the usual numbers. And people started jumping to the conclusion that Apple was doing this intentionally so you can upgrade to the newer iPhones. This wasn't the case. Over time, lithium-ion batteries degrade, and so if the phone is doing something intensive the battery couldn't supply it, the phone would unexpectedly shut down. So to prevent this, in iOS 10.2.1, Apple introduced CPU throttling in the iPhone for the first time ever. So if the iPhone was doing something intensive and the battery couldn't supply it, instead of shutting down, the phone would throttle down. This was something that a lot of computers do, especially a lot of Apple's older computers. But the problem was that Apple didn't tell anyone that this was happening until it officially got out there. So Apple lowered the price of the battery replacement cost in 2018 from $79 to $29, and Apple released iOS 11.3 in spring of 2018, which showed users the battery health of their device and allowed users to turn off the throttling if they wanted to. And in 2020, Apple was forced to pay every user that was affected by this issue $25. So even though the iPhone 6s had that major issue, it still got iOS updates for years to come. In 2018, iOS 12 was released and it brought some major performance gains for older devices, including and especially the iPhone 6s. In January of 2019, there was a sketchy report saying that the iPhone 6s was going to be dropped with iOS 13. But this wasn't the case, as iOS 13 only dropped devices with 1 GB of RAM. In 2020, the iPhone 6s got iOS 14, and in 2021, there were reports saying that the iPhone 6s would be dropped with iOS 15, but again, that didn't end up being the case, as the iPhone 6s also got iOS 15. Now, the same source that said the same info about iOS 15 is saying the same things about iOS 16. And even though this is incredibly sketchy, and they're most likely just guessing, it seems like the most likely scenario. So the iPhone 6s is at a wild ride, and even though it's most likely going to be dropped with iOS 16, you'll still get security updates for years to come. So don't feel like you need to rush out to upgrade right now. And it's definitely been a wild ride with the iPhone 6s, and even though it's most likely going to be dropped, it'll still remain as a memorable part of Apple's history as the longest supported smartphone in history.